Talia finished filling out the daily logbook, reached over to click the button on the electric kettle, rose from her desk and approached the long unwashed window of the duty room. Beyond the glass, the autumn twilight was deepening, the sky was overcast, and it couldn't decide whether to pour another cold rain or finally stop being hard with the city below and its inhabitants. Talia looked sadly at the grey, heavy clouds and sighed. Another gloomy day, pressing down on her almost physically, and tomorrow would be the same, and the day after, many more days ahead. All her life she had considered her birth in this region a great misfortune, even a misunderstanding. She adored the sun, the blue sky and green foliage, but fate had condemned her to live in a land where, for half the year, she saw no colours but white and grey, and red, green and yellow existed only in the form of hats and mittens. Of the remaining 6 months after winter, half were filled with rain and slush, and the brief summer offered little chance to enjoy itself due to swarms of midges and mosquitoes. In short, Talia had always considered the climate of her homeland to be outright miserable, and besides the visual dreariness, she experienced a temperature shock every year. Here, the wind meant either frost-bitten cheeks in winter, or in any other season, a ruined hairstyle in seconds. Though earlier, all this hadn't bothered Talia much. Perhaps she had been younger, or maybe the weather had worsened with each passing year. Who could tell? But lately her autumn melancholy had become unbearable, taking on a global scale. The woman shivered, and her thoughts took another way. Just as she feared, she had gained weight again, not just a little, but noticeably so. She had spent half a year torturing herself with diets and exercising daily, gasping and sweating, following the shouts of an online trainer, only to lose a couple of centimetres and then undo all her progress in just a few weeks. This meant that for the New Year's corporate party she would have nothing to wear again, because she wouldn't be able to change anything about herself in the remaining months, and her conscience wouldn't allow her to buy a dress a size larger. She would go to the party in her old black pants and lie that she hadn't had time to change. Worries about her figure made her turn involuntarily and look at herself in the large mirror hanging by the entrance. And on top of all that, she had long needed to visit a hairdresser, do something about those grown-out roots, maybe even get a shorter cut to stop struggling with her hairstyle. But who needed her fancy hairdos and curls at work? Almost always she pinned her hair up in a bun, so all that salon beauty was pointless. Besides, it was better this way. She wouldn't attract unwanted attention. What was there to look at anyway? The dark circles under her eyes, the 3 deep furrows on her forehead, and her not-so-expressive eyes. The kettle boiled and announced it with a loud click, making her jump as usual. She glanced at herself in the mirror again, once more noting the less-than-pleasant sight, sat down at her desk and looked at her hands with some alarm. Here, too, things were not quite right. Her skin was also not in the best condition, dry and slightly cracked. And it wasn't even cold yet. For some reason, it was her hands that finally broke Talia. She well remembered her grandmother's words, who, for many years, had been her example of a true woman and a treasure trove of life wisdom. And what could be told from Talia's hands, from her unevenly trimmed nails, one of which was also broken, a couple of hangnails and reddened skin? That she was a disorganized, sloppy, worn-out woman who, judging by appearances, occasionally washed clothes in an ice hole. And she was a doctor. Her hands, if not perfect, should at least be in good condition. Coming to this simple realization, Talia shamefully hid her hands under the table and even looked around, as if someone in the empty duty room could overhear her thoughts and immediately judge her. The worse a girl's situation, the better she should look. Talia suddenly remembered another of her grandmother's sayings, Her grandmother undoubtedly had every right to utter these aphorisms, as she herself had always been living proof of their truth. Born in a small village, she had studied at university in the capital, where she had perfected her art of being a woman with a capital W. Talia's favourite pastime was looking through her grandmother's old photographs, which still held a faint, acrid scent of fixer, the chemicals used to develop them. The black and white images depicted the remarkable figures of young men and women from a bygone era. The young women were nonetheless graceful and beautiful in their long flowing dresses with collars and brooches. Even the ubiquitous light socks worn under their shoes or sandals did not detract from their charm. Their curly, voluminous hair was styled in coquettish updos, lips were always touched with lipstick, and the finest adornment was a wristwatch. The girls of the 50s looked attentively and responsibly into the camera, smiling with their eyes, lips and faces. There were no unattractive or unappealing people in these photographs. Yes, we all tried to look our best, no matter what. We did it for ourselves. Talia's grandmother would nod, looking at her 50-year-old photo. She married an officer and moved with him to his hometown, a distant northern city. Here she gave birth to 3 children, a son who later became Talia's father, and 2 daughters. Throughout her life, Talia's grandmother maintained a style that set her apart from everyone else, a style that could perhaps be called chic. Her hats with small veils, which she stubbornly wore despite the sideways glances, even in the harsh frosts, were legendary. Until her old age, she did her own manicures, painstakingly inserting her arthritis-swollen fingers into the small scissor holes, and carefully styled her thin, downy hair into neat curls. "I would even draw on eyeliner," she would joke, "but I'm afraid I'd miss and poke myself in the eye." And so, the worse a woman's situation, the better she should look. Talia reminded herself of her grandmother's wisdom. But her own situation was far from ideal, and she probably looked as bad as she felt. What a shame, Talia suddenly thought. What's wrong with me? Why am I so irritated by everything? The weather, my clothes, myself, even this miserable kettle. What's happening to me? Why have I become such a grumbler and a bore? Why have I let myself go, both inside and out? I used to be different, and the world around me was brighter, happier, simpler. I remember. Not getting an answer from outside, she settled more comfortably in her chair, closed her eyes, and lost herself in thought. So, in a few months she would turn 32. A lot? Yes, quite a bit. As they say, a good reason to take stock of things. What did Talia Thompson represent? Despite today's unpleasant self-inspection, she was a young woman of quite pleasant appearance, because everything she had noticed wrong could be fixed. She was not unintelligent, had a good sense of humour and healthy self-irony, and, according to many, including those knowledgeable in such matters, she was a competent and talented doctor. Rumour had it she even had a chance to become the deputy head of the therapeutic department next year. Given the status of their hospital and the size of the department, this was quite an achievement for such a young specialist. She had many friends, real ones, tested by time, and even a bosom friend, tested not only by time but also by deeds. Fiona had been there when things were tough, not just for Talia, but for herself as well. And finally, until recently, Talia could have considered herself successful in her family life. She paused at that thought. Interestingly, the word successful came to mind, so official and formal, instead of happy. Yes, she might not look her best, be dissatisfied with the weather, her weight, the Minister of Health, high food prices, and who knows what else. But in her life, there was the most important thing. She was happy with her husband. Why couldn't she say that, even to herself, sitting alone in the duty room? Perhaps because she wasn't happy. Talia fearfully pressed her palms to her lips. Well, there it was, the truth she had been avoiding. But it was nonsense. She and George had been together for 5 years, with arguments and quarrels. But who didn't have those? Her friend Fiona had broken up with her husband at least 5 times, even filing for divorce once, and yet they were still together, soon to celebrate a decade of shared struggles. George, Talia's husband, was a wonderful person. George was impeccably honest, principled, caring, and an outstanding, highly valued professional in every sense. He was meticulous, reliable, polite, and punctual, incredibly punctual. As Talia repeated the last word to herself, she shuddered. It sounded more like a job reference than a description of a beloved partner. She felt tempted to add, "He enjoys the well-deserved respect of his spouse." It all seemed strange and foolish, because none of the qualities she associated with George related to happiness or love. Well, of course, George had never been a carefree jokester, scattering belongings around the house or money to the wind. He was serious, a defining trait of his character, approaching everything from his life's work to decorating the Christmas tree with the same gravity. His courtship of Talia was equally serious and thorough. "Talia," he explained a year into their relationship, "I'm not a boy, my character is far from sweet, but I love you deeply, and I will do everything to make you happy. Will you be my wife?" Unexpectedly he added, "If I were you, I wouldn't marry me." It was perhaps the first joke she had heard from him, and it left her astonished, yet unwavering in her love for him. For 4.5 years, Talia was happy with George. Though their life lacked daily bouquets of flowers, dedicated songs, or trips to the ocean, she felt content. They shared a love for the same films, scents, and days of the week, and both disliked tomatoes, tobacco smoke, and their neighbour. Their routines were synchronized, from waking up in the morning to yawning together in the evenings. Talia could buy him clothes without trying them on, and he would always choose the ripest fruits she loved. He playfully teased her about her efforts to lose weight, and she laughed at his subscription to a hunting magazine. Yet a shadow gradually crept into their life. Over the past couple of months, George had changed, becoming withdrawn and sullen. He lost weight, his clothes hung loosely, and he wore long-sleeved shirts even at home, as if constantly cold. "George, what's wrong?" Talia asked. "Are you feeling unwell? Let's get you checked out. I don't like how you look." "Stop it," he brushed her off. "I'm just under a lot of stress at work. We're finalising huge projects, and as usual, last-minute issues are piling up. Everything's falling apart, and so am I. Just bear with me. Everything will sort itself out, and we'll get paid well. I'll finish the project, get the money, and we'll go somewhere sunny, with palms and sand, like you always dreamed." Talia tried to initiate a heart-to-heart conversation. "George, don't you think something's wrong with us? Maybe it's time to think about having a child. We've been married for 4 years, and you've always wanted a daughter. Maybe it's time." "Talia, this isn't the best time for that," he replied. "I'm sorry, but I can't think about it right now." He seemed to force the words out as if reluctant to speak them. "So you don't have time for a child, or for me?" Talia asked, confused. "I don't know. I'm not sure," George muttered. Talia was genuinely frightened. For him, for herself, and for their future. She retreated, thinking perhaps he was just in a bad mood, and she was adding to his stress. George, who had never left her alone for more than a day, began taking 2 or 3 day trips. He returned from these trips exhausted and haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. "George, what's going on?" Talia demanded, cornering him. "You know, Talia, I've been thinking. It seems maybe we need to separate," George said, avoiding her gaze. "Separate?" Talia gasped. "Are you serious?" "Yes. No, I don't know. I'm sorry," he said, slamming the door as he left. Later, he returned with flowers, apologizing and embracing her. He explained that he was an idiot, exhausted and overwhelmed, but still loved her deeply. Talia wanted to believe him, but an ominous shadow hung over them. Talia decided that the root of her current unhappiness lay in George and the growing gloom of their life together. The recognition was painful, but she knew something had to change. Talia's thoughts were interrupted as she noticed the darkness outside the duty room window, with raindrops streaking the window. Winter was postponed after all. She could pour herself some tea before it got completely cold, she thought, and then froze. With the inner sense of an experienced on-call doctor, Talia infallibly detected a change in the room's atmosphere. It was as if the air had suddenly thickened. She opened her eyes slightly and straightened up in her chair. Just as she thought, her intuition hadn't failed her. Someone was running down the corridor. What could have happened? She quickly reviewed the serious and moderately serious patients in the ward. Several chronic asthma cases, 3 acute intoxications, a couple of ulcers. There shouldn't be any problems with them. At this moment, a junior nurse burst into the duty room. The young woman, already dishevelled from her constant fussing, now looked like a passenger who had missed her train and ran after it for a couple of stations. Her hair was standing on end, her face was flushed, a mask dangled from one ear. Overall, she looked as if their hospital was about to be urgently evacuated to another planet, and she had just been told. "What happened?" Talia assumed a stern, authoritative demeanour, trying to calm the nurse immediately. "What's with all the running around the ward? There's a phone at the nurse's station. And what's with your appearance?" "Dr. Thompson," the nurse said, breathing heavily, "your husband is in the emergency room. He was in an accident. He's all covered in blood, and it's horrible to look at him." Talia jumped to her feet, swayed, and nearly fell to the floor. A wave of nausea washed over her, her head spun, and her mouth instantly went dry. "Oh, God, George, how could this happen?" "Oh, he's not so bad off. They've already bandaged him up, and he even called on the phone. But the little girl, the daughter, she's in terrible shape. Her leg is broken and she's all bruised and scraped. I heard them calling the resuscitation team to send a brigade. Oh, Dr. Thompson!" Talia looked at the nurse, who was clearly distressed. "Daughter? What daughter? Whose?" "Your daughter. The girl was with him, with the man. He said she was his daughter. He kept repeating, 'Daughter, daughter.' And the man is your husband. Thompson, I'm sure of it. I saw his name in the admission card. And the emergency room duty doctor said it out loud. And I know your husband's face. I've seen him several times. Remember when he picked you up from work? You even introduced us." Talia instantly recalled the incident. The girl had indeed gotten tangled in their feet as she left the hospital, and smiled so broadly that Talia had no choice but to introduce them. George had nodded politely and probably forgotten about the eager nurse within 5 minutes, but the introduction had clearly made a lasting impression on Mabel. The next day she greeted Talia with a wide smile and the words, "Dr. Thompson, your husband is so handsome and such a real man. He is so well-groomed, serious and dignified," while she ties her ponytail at the nape and dashed through the wards like a schoolgirl. You wouldn't guess she was a doctor, not one of the nurses. Upon seeing Talia, the nurses' discussion club scattered with extremely busy and preoccupied faces, while red-faced Mabel froze in place. Talia had to remind her of the duties of a nurse in the therapeutic department and advise her to keep her mouth shut. And now she said that George was downstairs in the admissions department, covered in blood. However, the girl's words should be taken with a grain of salt or even less. But she does know George by sight and is unlikely to have mistaken him. And then she says she saw his name in the documents. Of course, his surname are far from rare and all sorts of coincidences happen in the world, but this seems too much for one time. The most absurd thing, though, is the talk of some daughter who is with him. That is definitely nonsense. All this flashed through Talia's mind as she ran through the endless corridors and staircases of the large hospital, where not only casual visitors and patients, but also the medical staff themselves, who had worked there for years, would get lost. The distance from the therapy department to the admissions department was indeed considerable and indirect, and during the journey a multitude of thoughts rushed through Talia's mind. One of them suddenly made her stop abruptly, gasp in fright, and clutch the conveniently located windowsill, feeling dizzy again. What if it really was George, her husband George, and he was with his daughter? After all, they had no daughter. It didn't mean he couldn't have one. Talia caught her breath and ran on. In the large, bright reception room of the hospital, a male figure sat motionless on a bench by the wall. The man was intently staring at one spot and seemed completely detached. Talia's heart sank. The man sitting on the hospital window was George. It was his dark hair, slightly receding at the temples, his prominent nose with a slight bump, and his chin with a noticeable dimple. Well, all that remained was to approach him and ask with which daughter he had arrived. Talia cautiously approached the man, who continued to look motionless on the couch, resembling a statue, and only when there were literally a couple of steps between them did Talia suddenly sigh with relief and almost laugh. It was not George. She was certain she had never seen the man sitting before her in her life. But damn, how much he resembled George. It was remarkable. No wonder that fool Mabel mistook him for Talia's husband. Even she herself thought for a few seconds that it was George. The resemblance was striking. Similar facial features, the same hair, eyes of the same colour, brown with a slight greenish fleck, and even the shape of the eyebrows. The only significant difference was in their expressions. Even now, in what was clearly not the easiest or happiest moment of his life, the corners of the stranger's mouth were slightly upturned, as if he was smiling with hope and faith in better times. George's lips, on the other hand, had been tightly pursed lately, with no trace of a smile. And their eyes were different. The stranger's gaze was warm, while George's could sometimes pierce like a corkscrew. Perhaps this was why the man in the reception room seemed like a kind and sincere person, possessing qualities she had missed in her loved one lately. But the physical resemblance was still astonishing. Talia looked at the man with interest once more. What was the nurse saying about his last name? That he was also Thompson? Quite an interesting coincidence. "Excuse me," she addressed the man. "Is your surname really Thompson?" Her words had an unusual effect. Perhaps it was simply a reaction to a human voice, to someone's presence nearby. The man sobbed, leaned forward, grabbed Talia's hand, and, burying his face in her sleeve, burst into tears. Loudly and violently. Completely at a loss, Talia stood beside the weeping man, looking at him in fright. Finally, the sounds grew softer. He stopped shaking and gently released Talia's hand, which he had been clutching tightly during his outburst of despair. Finally, he sniffled one last time, wiping his face with a handkerchief, gave a pitiful, embarrassed smile. Once again, Talia was struck by how kind and open his face was, despite the red eyes, swollen nose, and trembling lips. "Please forgive me. I'm sorry," he mumbled, sitting next to Talia. "I shouldn't have, and I didn't want to. It's just that Camilla was taken away, and no one is saying anything, and I've been waiting and waiting." "Camilla is," Talia prompted. "My daughter," he quickly nodded. "I can't imagine how this happened.
I just can't figure it out. And there was no one around. The street was empty. Where did he come from? And at such speed? How could this happen? What will happen now?"
"Did you get hit by a car?" Talia deduced from his disjointed thoughts.
"Yes," he nodded again. "I was just thrown to the side, but Camilla—"
His voice trailed off, and all that came out was a painful wheeze. Talia stood up and walked to the internal phone at the reception desk. "Hi, Geoffrey," Talia decisively interrupted the doctor's jokes. "You took a little girl from the emergency room about 20 minutes ago after a car accident."
"Yes, we did," Geoffrey confirmed. "But she's not a little girl. She's quite a grown child, 17 years old."
"So, she's quite adult, and here I was thinking of a little girl with bows in her hair," Talia thought. "And this man is obviously older than George, although George had been looking worn out lately and seemed to have aged visibly." "So, how is she, the girl?" Talia asked, feeling a strange anxiety, even though it seemed like none of her business to worry about complete strangers. A doctor can't afford to get too emotionally involved with every patient, otherwise they simply wouldn't have the strength or emotional resilience. Yet in this case, she wanted to ease the man's burden of worry.
"Well, how can I put it?" Geoffrey replied. "There's nothing too serious. We suspected internal organ ruptures, and she was unconscious for a while, but now she's stable. She's conscious, though her eyes are a bit unfocused, but that will pass. She's answering questions coherently and keeps asking for water. As for minor injuries, she has severe bruising. She'll be with us for a bit, and then off to the trauma ward. Hey, why are you so worried? Do you know her?"
"Oh, no, Geoffrey. We're complete strangers. There are plenty of Thompsons in the world." Talia smiled. "All right, Geoffrey. Have a quiet shift. Bye." She hung up the phone and turned to the man. He had been staring at her back the entire time, as if she held all his hopes. She felt a pang of guilt for chatting with Geoffrey on the phone instead of immediately reassuring the man. "Everything is fine. Don't worry," she smiled, approaching him again. "Your daughter is conscious. Her condition is stable, and tomorrow she'll be transferred to the trauma ward. You should come tomorrow, talk to her doctor, but for today, it's best if you go home, rest, and calm down."
"Thank you so much. I don't know how to thank you," he exclaimed.
"Oh, it's nothing," Talia smiled. "Besides, in a way, we're almost relatives. Well, not directly, of course," she hastily explained. "We just share the same last name, Thompson. But that's the most surprising part. You look very much like my husband, George. In fact, you're almost identical. That's why I'm here. A nurse rushed into my room, shouting that my husband had been brought to the emergency room, and with a daughter, no less. Can you imagine my shock after such coincidences?" Talia laughed, but stopped when she saw the man looking at her intently and seriously.
"Tell me, what is his name?" he asked. "Your husband, is he by any chance named George? He's 32 years old, an engineer, and does he have a mole right here?" The man pointed to his elbow. Now it was Talia's turn to sit down on the bench, her legs suddenly feeling like jelly. "It seems everything is true." The man cautiously sat down next to her. "You see, dear doctor, it appears this is not a coincidence. Your husband and me, well, we're brothers. Half-brothers, I believe, though I'm not sure. I always get confused with family terms. We share the same father. And allow me to introduce myself. I am Ryan Thompson. I am almost 7 years older than George."
Talia looked at the man in shock. If not for the belated thought that she was at work on a 24-hour shift with an entire department under her care, she might have sat there for a long time, trying to regain her composure. But the thought of her abandoned duties forced her to get to her senses. She jumped up, energetically straightened her white uniform, and felt as if
During all this running around, worry and shock, she had even lost a bit of weight. "Honestly, I don't know what to say. I need to think, to calm down. The important thing is to get back to work. I will be here tomorrow, of course," Ryan smiled, and again she was struck by how kind and open his face was. "If you like, I'm willing to tell you everything I know, and perhaps you can help me again, dear doctor, but in a different manner," he added mysteriously. Talia no longer had time to find out what he meant. She nodded, handed him a piece of paper with her hastily scribbled phone number, and rushed into the corridor. For the rest of her shift, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the emergency room. The man who claimed to be George's brother, whom she had no reason to doubt, stood before her eyes. However, Talia knew almost nothing about George's past. He didn't like to discuss his childhood and youth, jokingly saying he was born an old man. His mother had passed away 2 years before he met Talia, and he claimed not to remember his father, saying he left when George was about 5. "Don't you remember anything?" Talia would ask. She believed she remembered herself almost from infancy, and was furious when her parents laughed at her made-up stories about her early childhood. "I don't remember anything about him. And Talia, let's drop the subject. It's pointless. Father? This man never meant anything to me, and he means nothing now. Frankly, I don't even know if he's alive. End of discussion." His face would twitch, as if the very word father caused him physical pain. Talia had grown accustomed to seeing George as a man without a past. Even at their wedding, against her large contingent of relatives and family friends, he only invited his 3 classmates. "Talia, I'm probably not an excellent person. That's why I'm alone. But now I have you, so I must become better, right?" George would joke half-heartedly. And now she meets a man who claims to be George's brother. Incredible! Of course she would meet this man, and perhaps after this meeting she would begin to understand George better, and maybe she could do something to save their relationship, because she loved George. She realized this clearly and distinctly when, after hearing that he was injured and admitted to the emergency room, she was overcome with a terrible longing and fear of losing him. Ryan Thompson called her in the morning, and they arranged to meet in a small cosy pizzeria near the hospital. After handing over her shift and changing clothes, Talia rushed to the appointed place, burning with impatience and curiosity. Rushing into the pizzeria, Talia immediately spotted Ryan Thompson. Upon seeing her, he stood up, waved hello and smiled joyfully. Again, she was struck by his uncanny resemblance to her husband, only his face was kinder. "And he seems like a good person overall," Talia thought confidently, watching as a huge, steaming pizza with still slightly bubbling cheese was placed before her at Ryan's signal. "So, tell me the whole story, but keep in mind, I still don't entirely believe you," Talia said with an encouraging smile. "Well, I don't entirely believe myself yet," the man smiled in response. "You see, Talia, I had already given up on this story, accepted it, retreated, decided I had made enough attempts to fix things, to get closer to George. But maybe now, with your help, George will understand." It was clear that the man pronounced his brother's name with great caution, as if getting used to the sound of it. "You tried?" Talia asked in amazement. "You see, Ryan, I know nothing, absolutely nothing. Until last night, I didn't even suspect your existence. George never discussed his family, and we got used to thinking of him as a lonely person who found it painful to remember his past." "Perhaps in many ways that's true, Talia." The man suddenly fell silent, as if pondering his next words. "And I'm doubting now whether I have the right to tell you everything." You do, Talia assured him. "You see, Ryan, I don't like these secretive mysteries.
There's been too much uncertainty around me lately, and I don't want it to cost me my marriage with George. Maybe if I learn about his past, I can understand what to do in the present. What do you think?"
"Maybe," Ryan said thoughtfully. "You know that this will be more of a story about our father and me than about George. Fernando Thompson was a handsome, quite talented and carefree young man, a typical offspring of a well-off, prosperous family. He was an only child to his parents, so naturally he received all their love and care. As a result, he grew up rather spoiled. Yet, despite his family's indulgence, he managed to form a decent sense of right and wrong, and never felt entitled to everything around him. He graduated from a school with a focus on physics and mathematics, and enrolled in a technical university, living the carefree student life, punctuated by exam sessions. Being well off, he didn't have to worry about part-time jobs, housing, or buying a car. However, his fellow student, named Camilla, struggled with these issues constantly. She came from somewhere far away. Fernando didn't even know the place. She was an attractive brunette who made Fernando study the map more closely. As a confident and handsome young man, the star of their class, he naturally caught her eye. How it happened, neither of them fully understood. In their 5th year, they felt grown up and independent, believing no one could tell them how to live. But a student party that turned into a shared night, followed by suspicions, fear, anxious waiting, and finally the certainty of Camilla's pregnancy, happened too soon for them, despite their perceived maturity. They panicked, said hurtful things to each other, and went their separate ways. Fernando came to his senses first. "Camilla, I'm ready to take responsibility for you and our child. Let's get married," he suggested. "Go away and never show your face to me again," the girl replied bitterly. "And the child?" Fernando asked. "There will be no child," she said, leaving the university and returning home. A couple of years later, Fernando learned that Camilla had given birth to a boy, his son Ryan. It was me. He tried to mend their broken lives, but they were too different and accidental for each other to succeed. With his parents' help, Fernando secured an apartment for Camilla so she could return to the city and allow him to be closer to his son. Ryan grew up not minding that his father didn't live with them, but visited often. Over the years, Camilla softened and stopped blaming Fernando for her ruined life, at least in front of Ryan. Then Fernando fell deeply in love with Magnolia, and they married. Within half a year, they had a son, George, and everything seemed perfect, until life reminded Fernando of a simple truth. You can't build anything on deceit, even if it's innocent. Naturally timid, Fernando was terrified to tell Magnolia about his other child, and juggled 2 families for years, intending to confess but always backing out at the last moment. Magnolia found out the truth herself and didn't forgive him. Once again, Fernando was cursed. But while Camilla eventually understood him, Magnolia couldn't. She threw him out, divorced him, and raised George to believe his father was a despicable liar. This upbringing bore fruit, but along with his father, George grew to resent his brother, whom he had never even seen. After all, it was this other son who ultimately took his father away from him. At least, that's what I think he believed. Ryan said with a sad smile, finishing his story. "Personally, I'm not to blame for any of this. I tried to meet George several times, but, well, I won't repeat the words he used to refuse me. But that's not relevant, Talia. What matters is that you're here, and maybe you can help us." "This isn't right. It shouldn't be this way. Dad died 3 years ago, having lived what he considered a foolish life, and he desperately wanted me to make peace with George. He said something interesting before he passed away, a phrase I'll never forget. He said I should try to piece together something worthwhile from the shards he had shattered. Saying this, Ryan smiled bitterly. Returning home, Talia, quiet and thoughtful, kept replaying her conversation with Ryan Thompson in her mind, or rather, his story about George's family. Although, what family could it be if George himself never considered Ryan as his relative and, as it turned out, stubbornly refused his half-brother's attempts to mend their relationship? What is it like to live knowing that you have close relatives, someone related by blood and very similar to you, and yet be completely alone? No, of course, George is not entirely alone in the world. He has Talia, but that's different. The woman tried to imagine what it would be like if her parents, her younger brother Dan, who had caused her so much trouble in her childhood, and her beloved grandmother, suddenly disappeared from her life. It's impossible to live without family. Of course, her situation and George's were entirely different. She grew up in a complete family, while he only had his mother. That's how life turned out. But now he has the chance to fix, if not everything, then at least a part of it, and to feel the presence of a truly close person by his side. It's an incomparable feeling. Perhaps this is precisely what George needs to emerge from his gloomy state, stop frowning and finally smile. George, we need to talk seriously. Talia decided to go straight to the point without delaying the conversation. I found your brother. Well, not exactly found. He showed up. Completely by chance. Can you imagine? Talia stopped and fell silent because the look George gave her was too heavy and gloomy even for him. I ask you, he said, his voice tense, please never mention this person to me again. But why? Talia exclaimed. Listen, George, I really met him by chance, but maybe it's fate. Damn it, I only spoke with him briefly, but even in those few minutes, I could tell he's an excellent person and genuinely wants you to reconcile. I didn't quarrel with him, George said calmly, but the tension remained in every word. I didn't quarrel, and I don't intend to reconcile, and I don't want to communicate with him. I need nothing from this person. He means nothing to me. I don't want to see him, later or ever, no matter how little time I have left. George's words, which escaped him unintentionally, seemed to hang in the air. It felt as if they were almost visible, looming between them, heavy and threatening, to crash down with a deafening roar. Talia took a deep breath and said, What do you mean, no matter how little time you have left? What does that mean? What's wrong with you? Tell me the truth, I beg you. George looked at his wife with fear. His face clearly showed a desire to take back the words that had slipped out. And there was also a look of utter exhaustion and confusion. He couldn't hold back any longer, as if the armour that had constrained him for weeks and months had finally cracked. George slumped heavily onto the couch and waved his hand. All right, you'll find out anyway. You're a doctor. How can I hide this from you? And it's getting harder to hide with each passing day, George said bitterly and took her hand. A few minutes later, Talia sat with a look of shock and disbelief, her eyes wide and her breath coming in gasps. Her first thought was to go to the health committee and ask them to annul her medical diploma, as it had been issued to a complete idiot who didn't deserve to be called a doctor. How could she not have seen it all? The sudden weight loss, the chills, the fatigue, the bruises he hid under his sleeves. What more needed to happen for her to notice that her loved one was seriously ill? Is that why you reacted so strangely to my words about having a child? She asked, regaining some composure. And those sudden thoughts about divorce, George, were they your way of getting rid of me before it's too late? Do you think I'll enjoy you sitting by my side when I am completely bedridden? George struggled to find the right words. After all, no one knows how long this will last. They say it could be months, maybe even years, but the end is inevitable, and each day will only get worse and harder for everyone. Why should I watch you waste your life?"
"Honey, maybe you'll let me decide how to spend my own life. You know, George, I always knew you weren't the most cheerful person in the world, but I never realized you were such a selfish egoist. 30 years on this earth, in your proud solitude, and you've decided to go out the same way. Oh no, my dear, absolutely not. Please, give me all your papers. The conclusions, test results, everything you have," she asked George, trying not to show her shock. She then sat alone in the kitchen with a thick stack of papers and scans, looking at them through tears. Finally, she angrily wiped them away, dried her wet cheeks, read the next form, and froze in despair again. George had been diagnosed with a blood disease 3 months ago. Unfortunately, it was quite late when more radical treatment methods were required, and with each passing day, despite the treatment, it became increasingly difficult for him to conceal his worsening condition from Talia, as he travelled to another city for the treatment. "So, that's what these business trips were about," Talia thought bitterly as she dialed the number of George's doctor. Soon she knew what the medical documents couldn't tell her. George urgently needed a bone marrow transplant, but they couldn't find a suitable donor. And overall, Dr. Thompson's colleague sighed over the phone. "You know how it is with donations, especially bone marrow. People are extremely reluctant to come forward. Everyone is afraid, thinking it's very dangerous and painful. Try convincing someone otherwise. And out of those who do come forward, we reject more than half as unsuitable. We have very little of the needed material. But even from what we have, nothing is suitable for your husband. Complete incompatibility. And we don't have much time, so I'm sorry." "Yes, I understand," Talia said, regaining her composure. "Listen, Ivan, the best donors of stem cells are relatives, right?"
"Yes, of course. People with a familial connection have high histocompatibility. In most cases, relatives are the best option for transplantation, but George doesn't have any close relatives, as far as I know. At least that's what he said." "Well, we'll see about that," Talia replied. "Thank you. I'll call back later." "Ryan, I'm sorry, but we need to meet urgently. Right away. Can we meet at the same place if it's convenient for you?" she said quickly into the phone. "Of course. Should I order the same pizza?" she heard in response, a calm voice with an audible smile. And despite the tragedy of the situation, the horror of what she had learned and seen, she couldn't help but smile in return. And for some reason she felt reassured. She suddenly felt confident that everything would be all right. Ryan didn't hesitate for a second. "Talia, I'm ready. I don't know if I'm suitable, but I'm practically healthy. At least healthier than many of my peers. And if I'm found suitable, His voice broke. There was no need to say or explain anything more. Talia and Ryan sat across from each other in silence, completely forgetting about the cooling pizza on the table between them. The biomaterial taken from Ryan was a perfect match for George. And, a few weeks later, he underwent a bone marrow transplant. After the operation, the patient recovered quickly, surprisingly quickly. Within a couple of weeks he began to smile again, no longer frightening those around him with his gaunt appearance. "Talia, dear," he took his wife's hand and pressed it to his lips. "The operation, the transplant, the therapy, all of that is important. But it was you who saved me. After that conversation, when you got the truth out of me, I suddenly wanted to live again. Understand? I realized, here's my Talia scolding me, upset that I decided to give up. But I love her. How can I leave her alone? She won't survive without me. Talia, I owe you my life." "Of course you do. And please, never forget it, she nodded. But listen, we need to talk. You see, your recovery is thanks to another person, even more so than me. George. He saved you, and before you start acting like an old grouch again, please think. In short, the bone marrow transplant saved you, and the only suitable donor was Ryan Thompson, your half-brother. And let me emphasize, before you start your old routine, he volunteered without a second thought, even though there were some contraindications for him. Understand? There was a risk, but he insisted. And here you are alive, almost healthy, and even starting to look rosy again. And surprisingly, you haven't said a single bad word about your brother. And you never will again. Right, George? George looked at Talia, nodded, and began to cry. Silently, almost without tears. Perhaps that's how men cry, when they finally realise their mistakes and understand that they can be corrected, at least partially. A year later, Talia and George were choosing a gift for Ryan Thompson. His 40th birthday was approaching in a few days, although he jokingly refused to celebrate, claiming that such a date shouldn't be celebrated if you wish the birthday person well. "Ryan, you're something else." George shook his head. "Your hair is already greying. Your daughter is 18, and you believe in old wives' tales like an old woman. You don't have to celebrate your birthday, but I will. It will be my first time celebrating my brother's birthday." George blushed and lowered his head. Ryan looked at Talia, winked at her, approached George and embraced him. And Talia couldn't help but admire the two strong, handsome and manly men. Entirely different, yet remarkably similar, and, most importantly, brothers. "You know, Talia, this whole story taught me one simple truth," George said, looking at his wife with tenderness. "What's that?" "I've been resentful and angry all my life. At my father, my brother, my mother, even at myself. And what did I get in the end? I almost lost everything. My family, you, life, and the truth is this. It's foolish to waste life on regrets and resentment. You'll only end up the loser."